In case you missed the start yesterday, the Champion Showdown began as part of the St. Louis Chess Club, an online event, first with Fischer Random, or 9LX, and then with the Rapid and Blitz. This edition of the 9LX features Garry Kasparov, Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, and a lot of top-name guys. Today was day 2, a lot of exciting chess to begin with, some drama as well, and we'll kick things off with round number 4, Garry Kasparov with the white pieces against Fabiano Caruana. So, bishops start in the corner, knights start like this, and queen and rook, king between, which means that you can castle short this way, and you have to castle long by getting the queen and the knight out of the way. This game wasn't terribly exciting until we get to around move 20. Fabiano Caruana lashes out here at Garry with the move h5, and he's trying to go h4 and combine some play on the g3 pawn. Garry correctly offers a trade of queens, because if, again, you are going to be under pressure, you are being attacked by your opponent, it is good to trade off their most aggressive piece. Then we get queen e7, rook down to c8. Fabiano continues his aggressive intentions on this side of the board. A little bit of a counter-attack here by Garry with the queen and the rook. A trade brings the queen back to c4, and it's actually Garry who is trading off his opponent's attacking pieces and slowly figuring out the position. All endgames will favor Garry because he's got very powerful bishops. And then Garry, even to his credit, says, "Fabi, what are you doing? That's just a free pawn." And he's going to be on his way to winning it. And here, Fabiano offered a trade of bishops. And Garry played a move that, when we saw it on broadcast, made absolutely zero sense. Queen c2. That move loses a bishop. The bishop takes d4 check, and Garry resigned. So I went, all right, two options. Garry either somehow did not see that this was a check, or he mouse slipped. And it turns out that Garry did indeed mouse slip, and got up and obviously was very frustrated visibly, and the full point went to Fabiano Caruana. That's just, unfortunately, the struggle with the online game. You hate to see a guy like Garry Kasparov come back for 9 games against Super Grandmasters, and one of those games happens to be a mouse slip that causes him the full point, and Fabi wins. In reality, Garry had very legitimate chances to win this game. He's up a pawn at this point. It's to ward off Fabiano's incoming counterplay, but Garry was figuring out the clock situation and playing pretty well to kick things off, but Fabi gets the win. The other big round in the first one was Hikaru versus Magnus. And this one was really only spicy for a few moves. Right around here also in move 20, Hikaru's got an advantage. He's got an advantage because he's got the 2 bishops and slightly more active pieces. And Magnus, right around here, made a slip-up. He offered the very natural trade of the knights, because he's just saying, well, I'm slightly worse, let me trade off your knight, and then I'm going to stabilize. But if you look around this position, there is one major problem here for black. See if you can figure it out. The real problem is that your king is defending the knight and no one else is helping with this bishop. The king cannot be the chief defender of a piece, especially if the king cannot move away, because now neither of these pieces can move. So here Hikaru has a fascinating little idea. Knight takes b5, bishop takes b5, and the move bishop b8, which hits this pawn, and if the pawn moves up, you play f4 to try to play f5, and there's nothing black can do about this. If you play g6, with the defensive idea of f5, take, always look for checks, rook f1, and I pick up this pawn, I don't rush. And I actually have enough time to play the move g4 and then defend the pawn sufficiently. Rook f1 check doesn't defend. I can move my king. And again, while you can take this pawn, I will take your knight and win this rook. Not to mention the fact that I also can come back like this, but just to really zone in on this area of the board, this f4 pawn is untouchable, whether or not this bishop appears there or not. And in the game, this did not occur, and instead, we got this version of it, but now Magnus is in time to defend his a-pawn, and is able to get the b-pawn off the board. Nice defense from Magnus to also bring this bishop back, get out of the pin, and the game was drawn shortly thereafter. So a draw to start things off. Levon versus Firouzja was fascinating also around the middle game when Levon transferred this rook to this side of the board, and Alireza like got in here with the knight and the queen. Notice that, knight f6 check, you can't take because your rook hangs. But Levon not having any of it, he doesn't really care, brings his rook all the way to h3, and then begins counterplay, and just watch his queen. Queen f8, queen maneuvers to c8, okay? Then the queen comes back to e8, then the queen goes to b8, then the queen goes to a8, then the queen comes back to f8, and then it comes down to f4, and you jump in, and yeah, it's over. And bishop h3 and queen h2. This game felt like Levon just understood how to balance a game on the left side of the board, on the right side of the board, and he managed to withstand the play of Alireza Firouzja, who's generally an aggressive attacking player looking for creative ideas, and Levon won very convincingly. And actually that brings me to Levon's round 2 game. We're now in round 2 of day 2, which means round 5 overall, because every day has 3 rounds. So f4 to start things off, because it's good to open up the bishops, and we see both players here doing exactly that. But now a fascinating decision. Bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and d4. Trying to play for the center. Normally when you trade your light-squared bishop, you want to rebuild on the light squares, but both of them do this little switcheroo here to castle queenside, and Peter Svidler sacks a pawn, and triples Levon Aronian's pawns. But Levon Aronian was not to be messed with. He stabilizes all the pawns, and despite having a very obvious weakness on a4, plays knight b3, and all of a sudden you can't take this. And you can't take this because I'm going to play the move rook takes d8, or rook a1, and then, rook a1 right away, or rook takes d8, and then rook a1. And that's really the problem, is that you have this, and I'm actually getting counterplay on you, and not vice versa. So in the game we had b6, but e4, shredding open the center of the board, bc5, knight a5, and watch as Levon finds a nice idea here. You can try to pause here and figure it out for yourself. It's a super advanced move. Whether or not you get it determines whether or not you will become a title player. 5, 4, 3, 2... Oh, I forgot. I have to take a sip of my Lake Crocs. And the move, king a1, which of course you predicted. The point being that you're trying to land a rook on b1 and destroy on this file. And that is exactly what Levon Aronian did. And rook e2, the final touch, stopping rook a2 checkmate. That is mate with the bishop in the corner. And if takes, then in this position, you just take back. I was actually about to start calculating a takes b6, but I don't think that works. It doesn't work because after rook a2, take, bishop a2, take, you run out of firepower. So just keep it simple. Queen takes e2, life is good. This is not hanging also because of the bishop in the corner of the board. And Levon Aronian won his second round of the day. In the second round, we also saw the matchup of the players who were struggling the most. Both MVL and Alireza Firouzja through 4 rounds had half a point. And it was late in the game that Firouzja was pressuring Maxime. And here Maxime tried to stabilize to the best of his ability by creating counterplay on this side of the board. But Alireza found a nice idea. Queen b5 and bringing in his rook to put some serious pressure on MVL's weak king. And MVL was a little bit too hesitant to take the free pawn potentially, which seems like it could be a poisonous pawn. And here, black to move. I mean, you have a lot of winning options, but black to move in the simplest win. Pause it. Correct. Very well done. The move queen takes f5 with the threat of queen f2 and queen b1 checkmate. And if queen e1, queen c2. And Firouzja got his first win in MVL on half out of 5 to start this tournament. Disaster. And in the second round of the day, we also had 2 very, very, very big matchups. First of all, Fabiano versus Hikaru Nakamura. This game was 95 moves, but I will basically just boil it down to this fact. Very early on, Fabiano did something super strange. He played the move queen b5. And I suppose the idea of this move is that you want to play moves like a4, a5, and so on, knight a5 potentially, and just instigate on that side of the board. But a good rule for attacking for beginners is you shouldn't go in with the queen first, especially against a fully loaded defensive setup. think about that. That doesn't make any sense, right? The queen's not going to do damage against things that are guarded. She needs the other pieces to do damage, and then the queen will come in. We actually saw exactly in this game that Hikaru was able to stabilize his position, and the queen just stood there. It actually did not take part in the attack, and ultimately had to retreat, leaving Hikaru with the bishop pair. Hikaru then utilized the central space advantage, and it was Fabiano having to sacrifice an exchange, and over a very long conversion process that first featured some sort of simplification of the two rooks into knight and rook, which then featured a simplification even further into a queen trade, which then featured a simplification even further into Hikaru trying to get rooks off the board, but Fabiano refusing to try to get rooks off the board and then winning his b-pawn, and this is going to be decisive. That's really the problem here for Fabiano in this endgame, is the fact that his pawns were separated. He had knight 2 pawns for the rook and 2 pawns, and each side has a rook, but because it was Hikaru able to walk in like this to win the b4 pawn, he ended up being victorious and defeating Fabiano Caruana. The other big matchup of the second round was Magnus Carlsen, Wesley So. If you guys don't know why this is a big matchup, this is a matchup between the two guys that have the World Championship titles. Wesley So beat Magnus Carlsen in the final round of the World Fischer Random Chess Championship, and early on, Magnus went for the same idea as Levon Aronian with bishop c6, only he rebuilt on the light squares, and Wesley So got a absolutely dominant position, clamping down with the pawns, opening up his bishop. This one blocked in, but still good central control. And over the course of the game, he just improved his position to the utmost capacity. Magnus broke in the center, but it was not enough. And his weaknesses, dominated by Wesley's army, were too much to handle. And it was at this point that Magnus played the move queen c3, offering a trade of queens, but realized that rook a4 is simply hanging and resigned the game. And Wesley So defeating Magnus Carlsen once again, sort of asserting his dominance over the throne of Fischer Random. So far, no pun intended. In the third round, it was Hikaru versus Garry. So 2 GOATs that Hikaru had to play today. And he had to go up against Magnus Carlsen and Garry Kasparov. Hikaru with the black pieces did not get a very good position from the opening. And the unique thing here is that the bishops start in the middle and the queen starts on the side. It's curious to see how these guys are going to handle these positions. Garry actually very quickly played the move queen g1 to try to get the queen involved on the diagonal, and quickly developed his pieces, went for a long castles right here, and already stood maybe a touch better with his 2 bishops, his more active position. And here he had to play the move knight d4, offering a trade to the knight on c6, and if takes, takes, this kind of long-term plan of getting into a7, knight b6 would have been Hikaru's response. And essentially you're saying, I have 2 bishops, I have more space, I'm better. Garry went for bishop c4 in the game, also a logical move, hitting the e6 pawn, but this gave Hikaru a little bit of time to bring back his queen and bishop and then play on this diagonal with the lashing out move e5. So despite Hikaru sacrificing a pawn, now we see the real power of the queen on the counteracting diagonal, and bishop d3, bishop g6. Already there is a threat of mate coming, so Garry has to play king b1. There was a couple of flashy wins here. Knight takes d2 is 1, sacrificing the rook for the bishop, and then playing in the same way, or the move queen b3, an absolutely stunning computer idea. And if you take bishop e4, obviously you don't walk into mate, you play this, the gorgeous move bishop d5. And there is just nothing to be done to prevent the queen from getting in. You will hunt the king down, get it out this way. And this is obviously just not good, and black is winning. In the game, Hikaru chose the much more human approach with knight takes d2 and e4. And despite Garry getting the position down to something where it's holdable, the time situation here was 1 minute for Garry and 10 for Hikaru. And Hikaru came up with a nice idea toward the end of the game to win it. That idea being the maneuver with the a-pawn on move 39, a5. This looks like it doesn't do anything, but the point is that you want to play a4, locked in with the pawn. This guards that. You'll see that Hikaru does it in the game. Knight a5, knight comes into b3. Garry leaps into the fire with the move knight e5. This is an idea, this is an idea. These rooks see each other, but queen d1, and Garry resigned because after king a2, throw in one more check. and there is nothing. You are simply taking on f2, and the queen guards everything. It's actually Hikaru going 2.5 out of 3, but other big round matchup, quick spoiler, Wesley So, Fabiano Caruana resulted in an absolute catastrophe. It was at this stage that Fabi had just a transformation to a totally winning king and pawn endgame, with 5 minutes on the clock maybe. Bishop f3, king f3, and king d6. And this is winning because the outside pass pawn is decisive. King g3, king e5, king h3, king e4, and you're winning. This is equal material. Actually, at this very moment, white is up a pawn, but we know that in king and pawn endgames, king activity is so important. Fabi could have went for that, and he just didn't. He just didn't do it. He kept the bishop on the board, and Wesley was able to get it down to knight versus one pawn, which is holdable because you'll sacrifice the knight for the pawn. So a big opportunity missed there for Fabiano in the final round. Another big matchup in the final round was Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen. And all I have to say about this game, I'm going to fast forward to... You know what? I'm just going to fast forward to the end. This was the final position. Alireza resigned. Alireza did resign here against Magnus Carlsen, and he never moved his queen. Let me remind you that the queen starts in the corner. Now watch the game. Both players played in a unique way. Magnus trying to activate his queen early with the flank pawn move, but look at Alireza's queen. He plays the entire game just responding to Magnus's aggressions, and then Magnus finally says, all right, enough of this. Drop my knight back and come around. h3, knight h4, queen g4, and Alireza just... I mean, did you see that? Bishop e3, bishop g1, hesitation, and Magnus just... Another reroute, finally brings in the piece, wins material, takes on f4, and that's it. 33 moves played by Alireza, but he never actually managed to get his queen in the game, and Magnus Carlsen victorious. So nice bounce back there from Magnus. Strange stuff happening from Alireza. He did beat MVL, but the hesitation is strange to see on his part. Peter Svidler versus MVL was a weird one as well in the final round. Svidler sacrificed material very early, and actually somehow has a repetition. Can play queen a6, king b8, and repeat. He chooses not to repeat. He chooses not to repeat again, and then MVL just consolidates. Svidler sacrifices another piece, and sacrifices his queen, but the queen being lost isn't the biggest problem here. It's actually Svidler who has the problem, because he's got the queen for the rook and the two bishops, and it's a lost endgame. And MVL able to consolidate against Svidler over the course of time, coordinating his pieces in a nice way. Bishop's super dominant alongside the rook, and it was on move 53 that in this position there was resignation because of the threat and the threat of mate. Peter Svidler going down to MVL. It took MVL 6 rounds, but he does get his first win of the Champion Showdown 9LX. And in the final round, who else but Levon Aronian, who had an incredible day. And he, on move 19 against Lenier Dominguez, who actually at this point was tied for first, he detonated a beauty move. Beauty, beauty, beauty. Knight d3, and it cannot be taken by anything. You take with the queen, I take the queen. You take with the pawn, I x-ray you. You take with the rook, I have rook e1 check with the discovered attack. Crazy. So he gets knight takes b2 with the same idea. King b2, rook b6. Beautiful tactical shot here. Lenier did create counterplay, but Levon Aronian gets it down to an endgame where he's got knight and 5 versus knight and 5, but a very active knight. King is coming in as well, and notice how all of Levon's pawns are back. That allows the pawns to stay safe. The pawns for Lenier are overextended, and Levon able to create enough practical chances for himself to put Lenier under serious pressure, and it was here Lenier caved with the move a6, sacrificing the outside pawn looking for this, but Levon actually transforms the game into a winning queen endgame. So Levon doing it in all phases. He's attacking in the mid game, playing well in the opening, making good decisions, and even converting queen endgames by getting a forced queen trade, and this is just lost because you cannot prevent me from promoting on both flanks. Levon Aronian on day 2 goes 3 for 3. Hikaru Nakamura 2.5 points out of 3. Draws Magnus, beats Fabi, and defeats Garry Kasparov. And at the end of day number 2, these are your updated scores. Levon with 4.5 out of 6 and a 3-way tie for second with 4 points. Magnus Carlsen, 3 Triple Crown World Champ. Hikaru Nakamura, and Wesley So, the Fischer Random World Champion. Lenier comfortable there in the 5th place spot, the only person on 3.5. MVL and Firouzja still struggling, but hope to see them bounce back tomorrow. Coverage will continue tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. 2 p.m. Eastern Time is 8 p.m. or 20:00 in military time in Central Europe. And the coverage will be on my channel and the channel of Hikaru Nakamura on Twitch. So that is where we stream it to. Those of you who watch the recaps on YouTube only, there will be a recap as always. Some videos will appear right there. Join the Discord if you want to talk to the big community that we have off of YouTube. And if you want some of my openings courses, check the link in the description below. Peace! See you tomorrow.